tonight. I'd like to welcome everybody that showed up here tonight and just let you guys know that we're doing this ceremony for the life of Frank L Carbaugh, and that's where our post is named after. And we have a special guest tonight, Ben Thomas. So at this point in time, let's do the Pledge of Allegiance.
Flag's over here, guys.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this point in time, I'm going to introduce Ben Thomas. We all know him as the mayor of Greencastle. So welcome aboard there, Ben.
Please be seated. We're going to go back and forth with some sound to make sure that you can hear us okay. We're going to go back to Greencastle at the turn of the century in 1896. There was a young man that was born in this community. His name was Frank L Carbaugh. And tonight, we're going to leave here knowing Frank L Carbaugh. Before that, I am very pleased to introduce some very special guests, some very special friends of mine. This evening we have in our presence a World War II veteran, served in the 8th Army Air Corps in England. Mr. Sam Worley, who this past spring, June 13th, celebrated his 103rd birthday. Mr. Sam Worley.
Thank you, Ben. I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Sam, we are honored to have you here. Sam has been a family friend since before Bob and I were born. Our dad also served in the Army Air Corps. So they struck up quite a relationship after World War II. And Dad went in business in this county in the early 1950s, thanks to Sam Worley. Also with us this evening, Gold Star Mom and Gold Star Dad, my very dear friends, Bev and Roger Bittner. And also, very special guest, every veteran that's seated here this evening. You are this community's, and I say this as Mayor of Greencastle, this is your community's, you are our special guest. You know, you hear often, thank you for your service, but you really have to mean it. So thank you all for your service. All veterans, please give them a round of applause. And I think every veteran would agree with me, as I experienced as a police officer for many years. Your families, your supporters, they helped you get through some pretty tough times. So thank you to the supporters, to the families of the veterans that served and continue to serve. So, are you ready to go back in time? Sure. Let's visit Greencastle, and I want you to remember the month of July, because you will hear July quite often.
He is around for everybody.
I tell you what, that thing's possessed. It's on silence. Living here in 1896, you know, we can't imagine it. But just try to. No Interstate 81. Yes. Yeah. No answer way. The streets of Greencastle were not paved. You had two post offices, here in Greencastle and in Shady Grove. Commerce was primarily farming. Greencastle was a farming community. The town was the hub of commerce at the turn of the century. You had a few villages in the township. And interestingly, in 1900, the population of Greencastle was 1,900. The township population was around 4,000. Today, the combined population is around 20,000, men, women, and children. A lot of farms dotted the community. And the farmers typically did not work with cash. They bartered. They would come to Greencastle. Right here where you're sitting, this was the hub of agriculture. Crowell Manufacturing, right next door. They were making implements of husbandry, as it's called, farm equipment, boilers. Walk's Hatchery. You realize that was one of the first hatcheries in the entire nation. And we'll walk out this building tonight and look right over at it. Just imagine what Frank L Carbaugh as a child would have experienced. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about his life. There was a farm out on Long Lane between Greencastle and Shady Grove. That was the farm of George and Alice Carbaugh. They would have 4 children, including Frank L. Carbaugh, who was born July the 10th, 1896. Now just imagine what transportation was like back then. Walking, horses, horse and buggies. If you were rich, and I doubt if a farm lad was, you had a bicycle. And by the way, young Frank L. Carbaugh's father was a Civil War veteran, as we had many Civil War veterans right here in Greencastle, Antrim. And as a small child, Frank L. Carbaugh would see a modern innovation on the main highway between Greencastle and Waynesboro, known as the Waynesboro Turnpike. That was called a trolley. The trolley would come online in 1903, whenever young Frank Carbaugh was 7 years of age. You could go east, west, and you could go to Chambersburg. Growing up in Greencastle, Antrim would have been quite an experience for this young man that we picture every time we walk in to this memorial post. We went to war years later in what was known as the Great War. As my late mother would always say, the war to end all wars. What would Frank L. Carbaugh as a child have witnessed happening here in Greencastle? 1902 was the first Old Home Week. Frank L. Carbaugh was just a child. But the old boys would meet on the square. So I would imagine that was a pretty big deal. Thanks to Philip Baer. How often would Frank L. Carbaugh come to this town? Or Shady Grove? Both were close by. From my family history, as farmers, they would typically go to town 1 day a week. They'd get their provisions because they had about everything they needed on the farm. So that would have been a big deal to come to Greencastle, or even come to Shady Grove, because Shady Grove was a very active community because of farming. They would bring a horse in, and they would hitch the horse. And there's one location downtown where the steel pegs are still in a concrete wall that would have been used at that time by the Carbaugh family. And if you ever visit Kerm's Card Shop, go up that alley and you will see the steel pegs for horses and buggies. Those of us of a certain age, we certainly remember Barkdale's Quality Market. Right, Rudy?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely. Some great times there. So what else would he have experienced? Now, the Carbaugh farm, I have walked that farm many times because today it is owned by the Greencastle Area Water Authority. So it's right off Long Lane. And as I walk that beautiful land out there are two very, very important springs on that farm. And there's no doubt that young Frank L Carbaugh would walk to those springs every day to do what? Carry fresh water to the farmhouse. Those springs, Eshelman and Spangler, are still there today. And they supply Greencastle water. In 1896, the year that Frank L. Carbaugh was born, a water company started business from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, to sell water to Greencastle. The Consumer Water Company constructed, right outside of Frank L. Carbaugh's back door, a hand-dug reservoir. Even today, during the rainy season, that hand-dug reservoir holds water. The Consumer Water Company ran a wooden pipe to town. And if you were rich enough, you could put an outside yard hydrant in your yard that was tapped on to the main. Now realize Greencastle was just a square and a few blocks. That was it. Nothing like it is today. The Consumer Water Company ended up going bankrupt. So the town of Greencastle, back at the turn of the century, a little bit later, about 1908, purchased the Consumer Water Company. And they believed more water was needed. So right beside that hand-dug reservoir, a modern marvel occurred. A contractor constructed a 13 million gallon reservoir with a concrete base. No doubt, people came from miles and miles around to see the steam equipment build this reservoir with immigrant labor. And again, there is no doubt that young Frank L. Carbaugh would have sat there and observed this 13 million gallon reservoir being constructed. And by the way, if you drive out Reservoir Road tomorrow, that 13 million gallon reservoir is still there and in use today, being fed by the two springs, Eshelman and Spangler. Another modern marvel was occurring that same year, 1908 and 1909. And there's no doubt young Frank L. Carbaugh, if his parents would have left him, would have wanted to come to town to see this modern construction project. Any idea what that was? The High Line Railroad. The Cumberland Valley Railroad tracks. Still used today, aren't they? With a beautiful train station that was built back then. In 1908, opened in 1909. And there is no doubt, whenever young Frank L Carbaugh left for the service, he would have left from that train station. Now that train station opened in 1909, but before that, this was a busy hub for railroad traffic. The trains of the Cumberland Valley Railroad went north and south, up and down Carlisle Street, through the square. And by the way, when the High Line opened, there were 14 passenger trains daily, loading and unloading passengers. Townspeople and township folks would get on the train. They'd ride in the morning to Hagerstown to go shopping. Ride the train back. What a wonderful time. So those are just a few of the things that young Frank L. Carbaugh would have experienced as a young child. And by the way, remember, his father was a Civil War veteran. Was he a member of the Grand Army of the Republic post that was founded after the Civil War right here in Greencastle, Pennsylvania? 30 Civil War veterans chartered that GAR post. And talk about history. We're sitting close to so much history. Because the GAR post, Grand Army of the Republic, they met 2 blocks north of us at the intersection of South Carlisle Street and Franklin Street. So quite the history, very close by. Would that have influenced, would those Civil War veterans have influenced Frank L. Carbaugh to serve our nation? Remember, he was born in 1896, another historic year here in Greencastle, because that's the year the Rescue Hose Company was formed. Their station was at 60 North Washington Street in Council Hall, a building that I worked in for quite a few decades, as a matter of fact. And even today, as I go in there as mayor, I can just feel the history. Because would young Frank L. Carbaugh have wanted to go in there and see that 1741 hand-drawn pumper that the town bought from the city of Baltimore, Maryland, that the Rescue Hose Company still owns today? And that council hall was used for a lot of activities, not only a fire station. But as World War I, the Great War, broke out, men were called to active duty in the draft. And as many of you experienced, you had to get that physical examination. Physical exams were given at 2 locations here in town. The first was at the high school on South Washington Street. How many of you remember? You might have gone to elementary school there. Absolutely. That became a high school in 1905 when the country children of Antrim Township were allowed to come here to go to high school. So young Frank L. Carbaugh, where did he go to his grammar school? At the time, there were up to 27 grammar schools in Antrim Township. Most of them were 1-room schools. There were a few that are 2-room schools. And if you want to buy one, one's for sale out in State Line, Gus. That 2-room school is for sale. But I believe that Frank L Carbaugh would have gone to a modern school either on Grindstone Hill Road, that's the Dr. Ott home, or to Shady Grove, where the Christian Library is today. And see, the children all walked to school, and their teachers made $50 a month to teach the children. Now, Frank L. Carbaugh was a smart young man, as you'll hear a little bit later on in this presentation. He would see the first motor car at the age of 5, and the first biplane 10 years later at the age of 15. The first telephone would be a payphone at Whitmore's store in Greencastle at the turn of the century. The first electric plant started making electricity around the turn of the century as well. Would he have seen the huge estate at the edge of town on South Ridge Avenue? That was the Henry P. Fletcher home, beside Rawhauser's orchard. Remember, this was huge agriculture. Just imagine what his young life was like. His observations would have been tremendous. And I hope you agree with me that it's good to have a partial understanding of what young Frank L. Carbaugh would have experienced. The factories right outside this legion employed hundreds of people. The workers made $1 or $2 a day and worked 10 to 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. Again, supporting agriculture. Or, in times of war, supporting the war effort as well. Frank L. Carbaugh. I have a blow up here, the military index card of Frank L. Carbaugh. His date of birth, his enlistment date, which was 15 July, remember the month of July, 1915. His death was on the first day of August, 1918. That's why we say his name, Frank L. Carbaugh. Frank L. Carbaugh was wounded in action around his birthday, 1918. He was hospitalized for 2 weeks.